welcome to Board Gems. This is my regular video series with new videos on the 3rd, 13th, and 23rd of every month in which I go over an older board game gem. This video is about a game called Garibaldi. So this was published in 2007 by Nexus, which was an Italian publisher, and it was designed by Gabriele Mari. And he is one of two designers who seems to almost, maybe specialize is the wrong word, but they seem to have a real love for the Scotland Yard mechanic, right? Of the one versus many. Some players are hidden, some players are trying to find the hidden players. In terms of modern game designers, Mori is one of two that really works a lot within this framework. The other one being Frederik Møyerson, who's designed Guns on the Run and what else? Van Helsing. Garibaldi's not very famous anymore, but you might be more familiar with the later iterations of this series. So a year after that, this game itself was reworked as Mr. X by Ravensburger. That's basically the same game. The map is quite different. There's card play in this game. There's not card play as far as I know in Mr. X. I haven't played Mr. X. Now, Garibaldi's a solo design, but he would later on work with another Italian designer named Gianluca Santopietro on kind of a further development of this type of game. And the games that came later in the series may be more familiar with you. The sort of sequel to Garibaldi is Letters from Whitechapel. And then another iteration of that again is Whitehall Mystery. So both of those two games are probably more famous than this one, but this is almost the game that kind of started that whole series, and it happens to be my favorite of the series. And that's actually saying a lot, because I loved Letters from Whitechapel when it first came out. I really adored in Letters from Whitechapel the theming, and it was dripping with theme, almost literally dripping with blood, theme of the game. And it was really immersive. But there were some things about it that made me not want to play it all that much, right? And then you have Whitehall Mystery, which was a further iteration. It kind of streamlined it further, made it shorter. But actually, this game is much shorter than Letters from Whitechapel, and I find it's a lot more engaging. Now, like Letters from Whitechapel, this is for 2 to 6 players. In practice, the fewer the better. So like Letters from Whitechapel, this is a one versus many game. The one, in this case, is Giuseppe Garibaldi, who is a great historical figure and hero in Italy, in Italian history, modern Italian history. The other players are the Austrians, they're guards, they're patrols, who are searching the Italian sort of land, trying to find Garibaldi. So Garibaldi is hidden. The other players share 5 Austrian patrols. So you can play this game 6 players, and that means that every player controls 1 guard. Now, if you play Letters from Whitechapel, you'll know that's not super satisfying. And each particular patrol, each guard or each police officer in the case of Letters from Whitechapel, doesn't have a lot to do, and it's very easy for one player to just control them all. So it's still probably best as a 2-player game. So the box says ages 10 and up, which I think is pretty accurate. And I'm not sure this box actually estimates how long the game takes, but I would estimate 30 to 60 minutes, depending on how quickly Garibaldi is caught or is not caught. So let me show you how Garibaldi plays. I'm going to talk afterwards about why it's a gem. To set up the game, place the board on the table between the players. Figure out which of the players will play as Garibaldi. That player should have the board facing away from them. So like in my position, if you and I were playing together, they would get the Garibaldi player screen, which has the exact same map, although the numbers are reversed. So hold it up like that, which I will now immediately remove, but they're going to keep that screen. And behind their screen, they're going to take one of these Garibaldi tracking sheets. They have numbers from 1 to 30, and there's 3 rows. The other players are going to play as the Austrians. That's these pawns, the Austrian patrols searching for Garibaldi. I think the rules are just take the 5 colors and distribute them kind of randomly between the players. If you're playing with fewer than 6 players, spread them out as best you can. So for example, each of these shows a starting location, which is a color matching the pawn. In a typical game, yellow, for example, doesn't really have a lot to do early in the game, so what I like to do is say, oh, maybe one player plays blue and yellow, and the other one plays these 3, or something like that. But the patrols are spread out, and try to spread out the players amongst these patrols. And the players can get these tiles to show which patrols they own. This is the turn marker, which is going to start on the 0 space. These tiles show the 5 starting locations for the Garibaldi player. They're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You mix these up and give the Garibaldi player 1. The Austrians don't get to see that. The Garibaldi player, though, will look behind their screen and see the number, and then they're going to write with a pen or pencil in this spot here their starting location. So in this case it's 3, so they're going to write 3 in this box on the far left. The Garibaldi player will also get this little mask which fits over. I'll show you how that works. Finally, you're going to shuffle up the deck of cards. The cards are double-ended. I don't know if I'm using the word right. There's a red side and a white side. You're going to shuffle up the deck, give the Garibaldi player 4 cards, and each Austrian player give a number of cards as shown in the rulebook. They say by default it's kind of like a starter game. Give each Austrian player 5 cards to start. However, there is a variant near the end of the rules in which the number of cards an Austrian player has in their hand, their maximum hand size, and the number that they're allowed to discard changes based on number of players. And I do suggest you use that. So shuffle up and give each player a hand of cards. Some cards will show movement. You'll see this shows a walking. This is by boat. And we also have by horse. And there are also events. So just make sure when the Austrian players get their hand that they have them with the white side up, and the Garibaldi player will have with the red side facing up toward them. And of course they keep their hands secret from the other players. Clue markers, the Garibaldi player can get those. And this tile, which is to cover event cards. Now, in this game, when cards are played as an event, they're taken out of the deck, and you place them under this little board just to remind you not to shuffle them back into the deck. Garibaldi is a 1 versus many game. Garibaldi is playing against the other Austrian players, and there can be between 1 and 5 other Austrian players, but no matter the number of players playing as the Austrians, there will always be 5 patrols, just split amongst the players. Garibaldi's goal is to make it to one of these red spots on the opposite corner of the board compared to where he starts. He's going to be moving secretly across the map trying to reach one of these red spaces. The players controlling the patrols, that's hard to say, the players controlling the patrols. Their goal is, of course, to catch Garibaldi. It's as if Garibaldi has a pawn on the board that is invisible. At any given moment, Garibaldi is in a particular spot, for example, spot 50. And if a patrol ends its turn, the Austrians' turn, on the same space as Garibaldi, they capture him. And the game is over with a win for the Austrians. You see, the flow of a round is the Garibaldi player moves, and then all the Austrian players move, and then you check. The first thing you check is there a patrol on the spot that Garibaldi is on right now? If the answer is yes, then the Austrian players win. Even if it's on a red space. So if Garibaldi is here, moves here, but then the Austrian players move and put a pawn there, at the end of their turn, they would capture Garibaldi just as he's escaping. If Garibaldi is not caught, then you check to see whether Garibaldi is on one of these red spaces. If so, then the Garibaldi player wins. And finally, you check to see whether the Austrian players get any clues. That is, that one of their pawns is on a space that Garibaldi has visited within the last 4 turns. Then they get a clue. One of these markers goes onto the spot. So, first we start on round 1. There are 30 turns. That's how many turns Garibaldi has to escape the map. If Garibaldi can't escape by the end of turn 30, then the Garibaldi player loses, the Austrian players win. Now, as I mentioned, each card will show a movement type or an event. On Garibaldi's turn, he may play a card for movement and he may play an event. In that order. There are 3 different colors of paths connecting the numbers. The green paths can only be traveled by foot. The blue paths can only be traversed by boat. The white paths are roads. You can walk on roads from one space to one space, but you can also travel faster on the roads by using a horse. You can walk along a white or green path from your current spot to the next spot, or along a blue path by boat. If you take a horse and you're traveling along white paths, you can move up to 2 spaces. And what you would do in this case is the Garibaldi player would write down every space that they have visited this turn. So if they're on 47 and they decide to take a horse to 77, let's say they're already at 47, let's say here in turn 3, then we're on turn 4, the Garibaldi player would write 48 here and then 71 here. After movement, they may play a card as an event. And the events are different for the Austrians and Garibaldi. Again, it depends on what end is showing. So for example, this is an event for Garibaldi. And this can result in an extra movement. That's why there are 3 rows. So Garibaldi can move up to 3 spaces. Normally, walking and taking a boat only moves 1. A horse can move 2, but only by the white roads. And then the optional event at the end might allow you to move an extra space again. And in that case, you would write it on the next row. That last number will be where they end their movement. After they play cards, and they may not play any cards, they can stay where they are, at which point they would just write the number they're at on the top row for the column of the turn they're in. Just the same number again, so they're still there. Then they may discard as many cards as they want from their hand, and then they draw back up to 4. So if they are really looking for a boat and they don't have any boats, they can discard all the rest of their cards if they want, or as many cards as they want, and then draw up to 4 at the end of their turn. After they write their movement secretly behind their player screen, then it's the Austrian player's turn. And the Austrians can play in any order. One pawn has to complete their action before moving on to another pawn. And as they perform their action, you may want to rotate it or flip it over this cardboard tile face down to show that they've already performed their action. Each pawn controlled by the Austrians will either move or perform an event. But there can only be at most 1 event on the Austrian player's turn. Unlike Garibaldi, who can move and perform an event, a patrol can move or perform an event, and only 1 patrol can do an event each round. So players discuss amongst themselves, of course, based on the cards they may have in their hand. One player may have an event and want to play it, so the other players may decide to move, and they perform the same movements. So they also have walking and horses to move along the paths and the roads. All Austrian players move or perform an event. And again, each Austrian player may then discard a number of cards and draw back up to their hand limit. There may be a limit on how many cards they are allowed to discard. Check the rule book for that. That is 1 round. Now, all the pawns, say, are in different positions. Let's move them a little bit closer to the action. Something like that. And now you do 3 checks. The first check is Garibaldi caught? If the last number written down by the Garibaldi player is a spot that one of the patrols is on, Garibaldi is caught and the game is over and the Austrians win. Importantly, because the check only happens at the end of the round, it's actually possible for Garibaldi to move into a space with a patrol, and then on the Austrian player's move, the patrol moves off of that space, at which point Garibaldi is not caught. The check only happens at the end of the Austrian player's turn, at the end of the round. If a patrol is on the exact spot that Garibaldi is on now, Garibaldi loses, the other players win. If that's not true, then you check to see is Garibaldi in any of these red spaces. So the last number they wrote on their map is one of these numbers in red. If so, then the Garibaldi player wins. So assuming that no player has won at this point, then we check whether a patrol has found a clue. To do that, Garibaldi takes their sheet. Again, this is all done secretly behind the player screen. Places this mask over the grid with the number of the current turn underneath the arrow. So if it was turn 5, you would place the mask like so with the arrow above the 5. And you can see with this mask, you can only see the last 4 moves. If any current position of any Austrian patrol is in this box, that means that Garibaldi has visited that spot in the last 4 turns, and the patrol finds a clue. The Garibaldi player takes one of these tokens and places it under that spot to show that there is a clue there. So now all the Austrians can see that Garibaldi has been there in the last 4 turns. You only have a few of these tokens, but if you do run out, probably the old ones don't matter so much anymore because they represent old positions. You can just take the old ones and move them to new positions. The game can feel a little aimless for the Austrian players if they're not picking up any clues, and that's why there's a special rule that comes into play in round 8. At the end of round 8, if the Austrians have not found any clues for Garibaldi, they get a free clue. Again, Garibaldi will put the mask over with the arrow on turn 8, and then the Garibaldi player can pick any number that's on here to place a clue on. That's if the Austrians were not able to find a single clue within these first 8 rounds. That's the end of the round. Move the marker. Then it starts with Garibaldi's turn, writing their movement, playing cards, and writing their movement on their sheet. The game will end either when the Austrians capture Garibaldi, or Garibaldi makes it to one of these red spaces without also being caught, or the round marker goes past round 30. 30 is the last round that Garibaldi has to escape. If Garibaldi hasn't escaped by that point, then the Austrians win. That's it. You're ready to play Garibaldi. So this is kind of the first in a trilogy of games, with the later 2 games being more famous, from Garibaldi to Letters from Whitechapel to Whitehall Mystery. This is kind of the forgotten start of that trilogy. This game has a lot of nice little touches that complement the setting and really tie it into the setting and just creates a whole it's just a really cohesive whole. It really feels like the theme and setting came first. And every single mechanism in the game is in service to the theme and setting. And that doesn't mean that the game is super complicated because you're throwing tons of stuff into there to make it more realistic. It's still an abstract, what I might call a German style game, right? It is very similar to Scotland Yard, which is a German game. So this is definitely a German style game, but it has so much more theme and setting. So every card has some little text on it, historical text. Maybe talking about how Garibaldi got help from so-and-so, or talking about, Anita, who was being carried and how she was getting sick and stuff. You know what? Not necessary for the game, but you get to enter into that world a little bit. That's not a world I'm really familiar with. What this painting is set, right? Where this is set, when this is set, which is 1849, I think. I'm not familiar with that historical period in Italy, and I'm not Italian, so I had not heard of Garibaldi until I played this game. But I do agree, now that I know a little bit more about it, that what a great setting for a game. I suppose if I was more familiar with the area that this game took place in, that would be even more amazing. But like that map, right? The map of the area that Garibaldi is moving through and the patrols are moving through. It's a really interesting map that has its own unique character. I really like that. And sometimes that goes against balance or streamlining. I don't know how to say it. But, some games, and, I find Letters from Whitechapel is like this. Yes, the board is about something. And it's about a particular city or a period, and it's semi-accurate. But when you play it, this side of the board doesn't feel all that different from that side of the board, right? And that's not the case with Garibaldi. I really like the network of routes, and it's a unique kind of map that you can learn. You can learn the ins and outs of. So, for example, early in the game, Garibaldi will probably want to use more walking and boat cards, because there's only one road in that area, and you can only use horses on the road. So if you play a horse card, the Austrian players are going to know generally where you are. You're going to be on that one road, right? But north of that, you're going kind of a little bit of a detour, and it's a little bit slow going, but there's a whole kind of marshland area in which you can take boats. And it's slow going, but you get away from the roads, right? So the Austrian player doesn't necessarily know where you are. They just know you're walking and boating a lot. If the Garibaldi player is able to kind of escape that area and get closer to the end goal, that area uses a little bit less waterways. There are rivers, but there's more roads. So if Garibaldi gets in that area, they can kind of use horses a little bit more, in the sense that the Austrian player can't pinpoint where they are exactly. But if they use boats, then the Austrian player might go, there's only 2 rivers in this area, so we know he's somewhere in this area. So that really narrows it down, right? So I really like that map. That's kind of interesting. Letters from Whitechapel doesn't feel like, to me, like that has that at all. Whitehall Mystery has that a little bit, but this has it a lot. I just love the board and the network. It's something that you can learn and improves over multiple plays. And that's the way to play this. So I said you want to play this 2 players ideally, right? 1 player is controlling all the Austrian players, and 1 player is controlling Garibaldi. Well, obviously if you're playing multiple times, you'll want to switch back and forth, right? 1 player's Garibaldi, then they switch roles for the next game. If you keep playing with the same opponent, game over game, you get the metagame in there, you get the mind games in, right? Because it's like, last time, when he was Garibaldi, he went north into the waterways. Is he the type to do that again? Or is he going to try to do something different this time, right? So when you play it multiple times with the same opponent, you can kind of get into those mind games a little bit. You do want to play this 2 players if possible. And in fact, of all the games, Whitehall is good too, but I find this game is particularly well suited for 2 players because the board is very long and narrow. So you don't need as much table space. It certainly is something from Letters from Whitechapel, which has a massive board. I will say that Garibaldi, in my experience, actually works a little bit better than the other 2 games I mentioned if you are playing with more. Don't max out the players. Don't play any of the games. Don't play this or Letters from Whitechapel 6 players. Okay, each player's investment in the game on the searching side is going to be so minor that they could lose interest. Letters from Whitechapel can be a really, really long game. So I'm probably never going to play Letters from Whitechapel again. I do have Whitehall Mystery, and I like it. And I have Garibaldi, and I like this. So I don't need to play Letters anymore. Anyway, one major difference between Garibaldi and the other two games in the series is card play. All the players will have a hand of cards, and they're not double-sided, but they're double-ended. Yeah, double-ended. So you use one end if you're the Garibaldi player, and it'll have movement and certain events. And the Austrian player, the cards will do something different. They'll have different movement or different events. If you know me, and if you watch some videos and board jams, you might realize, or you might know this about me, that I don't prefer card play in a game that doesn't otherwise feel like it needs it. Like, if it's a card game, that's different. But if you have a board game, and most of the mechanisms are on the board, and just players have like a hand of cards that have like events or something, I usually have zero interest in that. And Letters from Whitechapel does not have it. Whitehall Mystery does not have that. They don't have cards. So, on paper, I feel like I should like this less, but I don't. I like it more. So for one thing, the cards are not very complicated. They don't do all sorts of wacky, crazy stuff, okay? They're usually just a movement type. There are events, but they're one-time use. So if you play them, they go out of the game. Those cards will never come back. So that could be a thing too. I like this event, but I don't want to use it right now. I want to use that later. So I'm going to discard that. Discards are free. You discard and then draw up to your hand size at the end of your turn. So you can just go through cards like crazy and hope that card comes back again later when you really need it. So when the card shows an event, they usually take a similar form, all of them. So like the Austrian events will usually require the player, the Garibaldi player, to discard certain types of cards or reveal a location they've been in the last 4 turns. And the Garibaldi player might play a card. It's like, pick an Austrian player, and that Austrian player has to you take a couple cards at random, or you say that Austrian player has to use this movement type this turn, kind of thing. They're really minor effects, but what happens is they really racket up the tension. At least on the kind of Garibaldi side, like the target of the events, because the Garibaldi player can't have a very detailed plan. The Garibaldi player may have to discard cards they had intended to use. They might have to just not move, right? They have to stay put. They were really hoping to move, but now suddenly they can't move. They have to stay where they are. You can imagine, thematically, like in this setting, in this environment, that would be exactly the case, right? They were hoping to take a boat, but suddenly, something happened. The boat wasn't there when it was supposed to be. Now they have to wait for the boat, right? So these sorts of things, it's unexpected events. And this is how events should be done. They don't wildly change the game. I mean, there is one event that forces one Austrian player to just go across the other side of the map. That's a bit annoying. But usually the events don't have a huge impact on what happens, but they just add limitations. And those limitations are where the tension comes for the Garibaldi player. It is an incredibly tense game for Garibaldi. When you play this game and you're Garibaldi and the guards, the patrols are so close to you, you almost feel like you don't want to breathe, right? And you don't have to move. You can stay where you are, turn after turn after turn, and hope the guards just move on if you want to. But of course you have a time limit. Feels like a very generous time limit, 30 turns. But if the patrols are hot on your tail, you can easily, once you start getting to turn 15 or so, then it's like, oh my god, I still have a ways to go. I gotta speed up, right? And then you take chances, and then that's how the guards get you. And the card play does a nice bit of handicapping too. And it helps with different player counts, because the hand size varies. Now, in the basic rules, the Austrian player always has the same number of cards regardless of number of players. There's a variant in the back, strongly recommended, in which the hand size changes depending on how many Austrian players there are. If an Austrian player is playing alone, so one player is controlling all 5 patrols, they have a big hand of cards. They're playing 1 card per patrol, right? So they got more choice. And If there's fewer players, then each player has their own hand of cards, but it's a small hand. And in a multiplayer game, of course, that's good because it prevents the alpha player cooperative quarterbacking problem. It goes by a few different names, but it's the case where, one player is really familiar with the game or is really bossy and thinks they know better than everyone else and just tells everybody else what they should do on their turn. Having a hand of cards helps prevent that. You don't have to have the cards face up in front of you. In fact, you shouldn't, because there's a Garibaldi player, right? But because you have a hand of cards, you have to communicate. So the players have to talk to each other, right? It was like, well, I'm trying to get over there, but I don't have a horse right now, so it's going to be slow going. That sort of thing, right? And it's like, if you have an event, if you're an Austrian player and you have a particular event that would help you, of course, you're communicating that to the other players, right? And you have to coordinate because only one of you can play an event. And when you play an event, you're not moving your pawn that turn. So there's much more coordination, I feel, and it's a more fun coordination. It's real cooperation. And you can use the card hand size to handicap a little bit. So I think by default, the Austrian player, like every Austrian player, has like 5 cards. And if you're only playing a 2-player game, so there's 1 Austrian player, the variant says to have 9. But you can tweak it based on how easy or hard you find it, right? If the Austrian player has 5 cards and it's too hard for them, play with a 9-card hand, right? As the variant says. Maybe that goes too far in the other direction. Maybe that's good for, the average gamer, right? That's why they picked that in the rules. But maybe for your particular group, the 2 of you, you'll find that 9 is too many. The Austrian player has too easy a time. So you can tweak that down. Next time you play, let's try a hand of 7 cards. That's what me and my son did. We played this a lot, 2-player. Love it. I do strongly suggest you use that variant. That the hands, because if you go by the default rules, in a 2-player game, the Austrian player has just too few cards. You have like a hand of 5 cards, and you have 5 patrols. So you're using 1 card per patrol. You get to choose which card applies to which patrol, but otherwise you don't really have any choice. And if you're still having a hard time as the Austrian player winning, even though you have a massive hand of cards, you could consider adding note-taking. In games like Scotland Yard, for example, you can always see the type of transportation that the Mr. X, the hidden player, takes, right? Oh, they took a bus this time, and then they took a taxi or whatever. And you can always see every step of the way. And I think there's a case in Mr. X as well. And in this game, there's no element of that. So for some people might call it a memory game as a result, because they took a walk, and then they took a boat, and then they walked again twice, and then a horse, right? After 5 or 6 turns in, you kind of lose that thought. But assuming if the Austrian players are really having a hard time, you can consider taking notes. I think it's more interesting the way it is. Like, you're more worried about the now as opposed to worrying what they did 6-7 turns ago and then trying to deduce exactly what point they are. No, you feel they're in this area and you try to close the net, right? You definitely don't want to play this with the maximum player count of 6. Each player has their own pawn. Look, it works. The thing is that the pawn, it's a long, narrow board, and the pawns are spread out along the whole length. Garibaldi starts in one corner and tries to end somewhere in the other corner, basically. Well, one of those pawns, because they're all spread out along the length of the board, one of those pawns is way out of the action at the beginning of the game. And there's a second pawn which is, slightly closer, but still pretty far, right? And at the beginning of the game, there's only 1 or 2 guards that are in play, and several turns in, then you can get a 3rd guard in play. But if everybody's controlling 1 guard, and the people controlling those guards back there, there's going to be just spending turn after turn after turn trying to get forward, right? Or they're the one that ends up doing events, and then they don't move at all. So what you want to do is you want to play fewer players. You don't have to play 2. It's best with 2. But 3 or 4 totally works fine. You spread out the 5 Austrian patrols amongst the players, and just make sure you balance out the guards on one end and the guards on the other end. So one player has, at least 1 on either end. So they still have something to do on this side, and they still have something to do on this side. So the Garibaldi player, oh, so fun, so tense playing as Garibaldi. not as tense for the Austrians. I remember, it wasn't the first game I played. It might have been the first game I played with my son. I was the Austrians, he was Garibaldi. I did catch him in the end, but for the first, 12 turns, I had no clues at all. There is kind of a gimme. I'll come back to that on turn 8. I'll come back to that. But I'm going through this, I'm moving the guards. I think I have an idea where he is, but I didn't close the net enough, so I think, maybe he got through. And I'm pulling my guards back to try to cover the bases. And I'm playing this whole game, and I'm not getting any clues at all because I'm withdrawing my guards. You got to really get a guard in there moving around and try to pick up some clues, but it can be tricky because you can only pick up clues from the last 4 turns. So if the trail feels realistic to me, right? That feels like you come a week later, you're not going to know whether Garibaldi was there or not, right? It has to be fresh, those footprints or something. So I really like that aspect, but it does make the game hard if you can't get any clues. And there is a gimme on turn 8. It says by turn 8, if you, the Austrian player, haven't seen a single clue from Garibaldi at all, so you have no idea where he is, then you get a free clue. Seems like a patch. If Garibaldi is playing really cautiously, then the Austrian player won't find any clues until later, and then that first part of the game can be quite boring. So maybe on paper, from a design point of view, Whitehall Mystery is kind of the best that way, because the game is broken up into thirds, I think. It's not quarters, it's thirds, I think. And so as the game progresses, you learn where the murderer player has been, where they've already gone. So in that last round, the general area they have to go to. That's interesting. You have a little bit more to go on. But this one, you always know where the Garibaldi player has to go. There are a couple of start spaces, but they're all close to each other. There are several end spaces, which are a little bit more spread out, but they're still not that many. And so the general direction that Garibaldi is playing. You have to get the guards in there sniffing around and hope they catch the scent. If they don't, the Austrian player can have a little bit of a boring time. That's really the only downside. It would be really nice if the Austrian players could feel some of the same tension as Garibaldi. It is more fun to play as Garibaldi. So if you're playing 2-player, you may want to play 2 games. Game's not very long. 2-player games, 30, 45 minutes. So play 2, back-to-back, switch roles. I will say this is probably my favorite game of the 3. I loved Letters from Whitechapel when it first came out. I can't see me ever playing that game again. It's too long. It's too boring for the policeman players, especially if the roles are kind of spread out. I'll play it, but I would prefer this or Whitehall Mystery. And Whitehall Mystery is kind of the most streamlined version, and it's great. And the ratings on Board Game Geek bear that out, right? It is a very good game. But I love the personality of Garibaldi more. Whitehall is streamlined just a little bit. I shouldn't say a little bit too much. I like streamlined games, but sometimes when you streamline, you lose a little bit of personality. And this game is full of personality. It really is. Now, speaking of personality, of course, about a year or so later, Garibaldi was revamped in an edition from Ravensburger called Mr. X. So, I guess set in the Scotland Yard universe. The Scotland Yard cinematic universe. Game flow is basically the same. Of course, the board is very, very different. And it seems more possible to travel farther, which has never been a problem for me for this game, but in that board, which I haven't played, I just looked at pictures, and it's like, there's airports. You go from airport to airport, similar to the underground stations in Scotland Yard. I prefer that Garibaldi moves slowly so that the Austrian player can kind of close that net, right? That's interesting. But I haven't played Mr. X. Maybe it doesn't work that way at all. I don't know. And the board is interesting. It's more square, and it has different difficulty settings. So based on how hard you want to make it, you can have the start point and end point in different locations. So it's flexible that way. I haven't played Mr. X. I'd love to try it, but just looking at it, I can't see it has the personality of this one. And I don't think it has card play. I think it uses tokens instead of cards. It certainly doesn't have like the types of events. Again, I'm not an event guy. I don't like events. I don't like card play. If you can streamline the game so it doesn't need cards, I'm usually 100% on board with it. And I was surprised to learn that about myself, that this is an example of a game where that's not the case with me. That I actually do like the additional chaos that the events bring that keep all the players more on their toes. This game does events right as far as I'm concerned. The events usually aren't crazy powerful. They usually kind of follow a similar flow, which just restricts the player's options for the next turn. And so you just can't plan ahead too much. I like that. Usually when I say whether, like, is this game easy to find or not, the first thing I check is Board Game Geek. How many people are trading it away? How many people want it in trade? More Board Game Geeks are looking to trade away their copy of Garibaldi than are looking for it in trade. So usually that means it's pretty easy to find a used copy. If you want to offer a trade, usually you'll find people on like Board Game Geek or whoever who are willing to trade it away. They're not so attached to it. I just don't know how many of these are floating around out there. Maybe Mr. X is more common since it was published by Ravensburger. This company, Nexus, is... I don't even think they're around anymore. But I don't know how many they made, so I don't want to say whether it's easy to find or hard to find. This will not be easy to find in stores, but you might not have too hard a time finding a used copy, because more Board Game Geeks are looking to trade away their copies than there are looking for them to get in trade. So that's usually a good sign, that its trade value is relatively low, and hopefully you'll be able to find a copy. Look, Letters from Whitechapel, fired as far as I'm concerned. Whitehall Mystery has some advantages. It's in a smaller box. It plays basically as good as this one, 2 players. Maybe worse multiplayer than this one. But it's in a small box, and it's really streamlined, and it is a great game. I have no real complaints about Whitehall Mystery. It just loses some of the flavor that I happen to really like in this game. I don't know much about this historical topic. And don't get me wrong, like, this is not an educational game per se, right? This is a real game. And even if it didn't have that historical, like, flavor text and stuff like that, even just knowing this about the game, like the art and the topic, but not really knowing any details about it at all, I would still enjoy this one the most of the 3. So this is my favorite of the Garibaldi, Letters from Whitechapel, Whitehall Mystery trilogy. Might not be your favorite. I think Whitehall Mystery is still super easy to find, I think. So, you don't have to necessarily go crazy out of your way to find this if you can get Whitehall Mystery. For what it's worth, I like this one the most. Thanks for watching. Remember, older games like Garibaldi don't stop being good just because newer games come out. Take care.